East St. Louis, once conceived as an industrial titan, a junction of railways, slaughterhouses, factories, and transport networks, erected along the Mississippi River during the 19th century. It became one of Illinois' most populous municipalities by mid-century, its residents bound to the rhythm of mechanized labor. The eruption of racial violence in 1917, fueled by labor tensions, competition for jobs, and a climate of racial resentment, exacted a grim toll. Scores of black citizens were murdered, their neighborhoods obliterated, and municipal order validated the atrocity through indifference or complicity. That massacre marked an enduring inflection in the city's trajectory. By the 1960s, industrial divestment invaded. Major employers departed, draining the city's revenue and leaving it incapable of providing elementary governance. Infrastructure failed. Streetlights remained unreplaced, buildings were abandoned mid-renovation, and the fire department was overwhelmed. Throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s, East St. Louis amassed one of the nation's highest per capita homicide rates, averaging some 57 murders annually, while its police departments, starved financially, lacked operational radios and endured siloed communication across jurisdictions. In 1989 alone, the city recorded 63 homicides, with a population of barely 40,000 at the time. This gave East St. Louis the highest per capita murder rate in the entire United States, outpacing cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, where the raw number of killings was higher but dispersed across millions of residents. Here, the concentration of bloodshed was unparalleled. Murder was not an outlier, but a statistical constant. The concentration of death in East St. Louis was staggering. Its homicide rate eclipsed not only American metropolises, but also rivaled the most violent regions of the globe. In some years, the odds of being murdered in East St. Louis were greater than in Medellin, Colombia, then regarded as the epicenter of cartel violence. International conflict zones often reported lower per capita death rates than this American city, sitting in the heart of Illinois. To call it a municipality was a technicality. In reality, it had become a killing ground where violence was as consistent as taxation elsewhere. But the numbers alone fail to convey the reality of life in East St. Louis during these years. Violence was omnipresent. Gunfire rang out with such frequency that it ceased to shock. Entire neighborhoods operated as open-air drug markets, where disputes were settled not with negotiation, but with gunfire in broad daylight. Murders, assaults, rapes, and robberies stacked on top of one another, until they blurred into routine. Mothers buried their sons with grim regularity, and the morgue often exceeded its capacity. The city's police force was crippled, both financially and operationally. Patrol cars often sat idle for lack of gasoline. Radios failed, leaving officers unable to communicate during emergencies. At times, there were barely enough officers on duty to respond to calls, and even when they did arrive, backup could be miles away or never come at all. Detectives carried caseloads so overwhelming that many homicides went uninvestigated for months, some never solved at all. Evidence was misplaced, reports went unfinished, and entire investigations collapsed under the sheer weight of dysfunction. Fires gutted abandoned properties nightly, stretching the depleted fire department beyond its limits. Trash lay uncollected until it rotted in alleys, feeding vermin. Schools served more as warehouses for youth than centers of learning, their roofs leaking, their textbooks outdated by decades. Civic order had not simply eroded, it had been extinguished. Children grew up amid this chaos, their understanding of normality shaped by violence. They learned early that the crack of a gunshot was more reliable than the sound of a siren. They internalized that survival depended on instinct rather than authority, because authority had become a hollow promise. In East St. Louis, the line between criminal and victim blurred. Everyone was vulnerable, and no one could count on the law to intervene. The misery of East St. Louis was made sharper by its proximity to Belleville, the seat of St. Clair County. Just a short drive away, Belleville maintained a veneer of order. Police responded to calls, garbage was collected, and schools retained accreditation. Its residents lived with the expectation that the city would function, that civic institutions would shield them from disorder. For the people of East St. Louis, this contrast was corrosive. Belleville's stability stood as a constant reminder of their abandonment. Families who could afford to flee often crossed the boundary, searching for safe streets and functional classrooms. Those who remained looked across that invisible divide with bitterness, aware that geography alone determined whether a child would be educated in a classroom with heat and books, or left in a crumbling building where hope had already fled. Tensions simmered between the two cities. Belleville residents regarded East St. Louis as a reservoir of crime and instability, wary of its citizens spilling across the boundary. Meanwhile, East St. Louisans saw Belleville as a community that hoarded resources and reinforced their exclusion. The migration of families into Belleville was met with suspicion, further widening the gulf between the two populations. The disparity was not abstract, it was lived. To grow up in East St. Louis was to know constant vulnerability. To grow up in Belleville was to inherit at least the promise of order. The boundary between them was less a county line than a dividing wall between two irreconcilable worlds. It was within this crucible of violence, neglect, and disparity that Lorenzo Fayne came of age. The civic collapse of East St. Louis was not a distant condition. It was the air he breathed and the ground beneath his feet. And just as East St. Louis had become a place where lawlessness outpaced law, Fayne himself would evolve into a figure who embodied the violence around him, reshaping it into something even more terrifying. Lorenzo Fayne was not created in a single act of violence, nor in the moment of his first murder. He was constructed, layer by layer, year after year, by the brutality of those meant to protect him. His life was not a deviation from the ordinary. It was a design, a murderous recipe, as his attorney John O'Gara would later call it. The collision of genetic damage, relentless abuse, and a home steeped in degradation. From the beginning, Fayne's existence was marked by affliction. He was born in Milwaukee in 1971, the child of Juanita Smith, a dancer, heavy drinker, and drug addict, and a father permanently scarred by Vietnam. Doctors testified that his mother drank so heavily during pregnancy that she may have inflicted brain damage before her son ever drew his first breath. His father returned from war fractured, consumed by trauma and addiction. Not long after Lorenzo's birth, he disappeared entirely, leaving no memory, no presence, no guidance. What replaced him was worse. Juanita remarried, binding her family to a man as addicted and unstable as she was. Discipline in that household was not correction. It was torment. Lorenzo was tied to poles, beaten into unconsciousness, and locked in attics for defiance. His sister Lawanda still remembers the sound of his cries, recalling how their stepfather would mete out punishment with ritualized cruelty. She hit him as hard as she could in the head with anything she could get her hands on, one investigator testified. The weapons were whatever lay within reach: skillets, belts, brooms, and fists. Relatives recalled an incident when Lorenzo was only 8. After retrieving a simple handful of crackers from the refrigerator, his stepfather seized him by the throat and choked him until he lost consciousness. Psychologist Dr. Daniel Cuneo, who later evaluated Fayne, told the jury, "Lorenzo Fayne had the most horrendous family history I've ever seen in my 24 years of practice." Another social worker echoed, "If you wanted to produce a killer, one would raise him the way Lorenzo Fayne has been raised." The child himself bore the scars. Repeated blows left him with neurological damage, a brain so battered that experts argued it impaired his impulse control and distorted his personality. Dr. Michael Gellert, a neurologist, testified that Fayne showed signs of frontal lobe dysfunction, damage that eroded self-control and left him volatile, impulsive, and emotionally erratic. Certainly in many cases of brain impairment, he explained, a person loses the capacity to control behavior in a normal fashion. But the brutality did not end with beatings. From his earliest years, Fayne was forced to witness violent domestic battles, his mother brawling with family members, once attacked with a sledgehammer and stabbed by her own partner. Additionally, he witnessed his mother be raped by his stepfather, and once while they walked home crossing through an alleyway, he was also humiliated and attacked outside the home. At just 7 or 8, a neighborhood boy brutally raped him, while his stepfather punished him afterward for allowing it to happen. By adolescence, He had been branded by neighbors as a little pervert, treated as a spectacle of shame rather than a child in need of help. By 9 years old, Lorenzo was already speaking to psychiatrists about experiences no child should endure. By 10, his mother told a social worker that he was acting a little weird and asked that he be removed from her home. At 11, he was drinking alcohol regularly. By 14, he was a habitual marijuana user. His adolescence unfolded inside institutions. Juvenile centers and group homes became revolving doors, brief incarcerations followed by releases into the same chaos. When he was 10, the first night he was there, he was brutally raped by another inmate. At 13, frail and barely 90 pounds, he was placed in a group home where he was raped by older residents. At 14, he was raped again in another juvenile facility. At one detention center, staff noted his disturbing behavior, graphic sexual comments, obsessive fixations, eruptions of violence. One incident led to his arrest for choking and assaulting another boy. The testimonies about his adolescence read like an anatomy of destruction. He was taken by an aunt to taverns, where grown women treated him as a sexual object. He was mocked by peers, ridiculed by adults, degraded by his stepfather until unconscious. His grandmother recalled how he would break down in tears at her home, begging for normalcy, confessing that something inside him was wrong. He badly wanted a mother, she told the court. Yet even his brief sources of refuge dissolved. His grandmother eventually died. His mother remarried and vanished again. His half-brother, Edward Brantley, who admitted to brutalizing Fayne himself, would later be convicted in Wisconsin of killing an infant after fracturing the child's skull. Fayne's attorney summarized the collapse of his support system with a single chilling sentence. Everyone he's ever loved has left him. His grandmother died. His wife divorced him. His mother didn't show up, again. By the time experts evaluated him in prison, Fayne's psychological profile was a portrait of ruin. His IQ fell just below normal, his emotional capacity crippled by abuse. He showed antisocial traits, bursts of rage, and a grotesquely distorted sense of sex and control. But these same experts made it clear, while Fayne's background might explain his compulsions, it could never excuse what followed. There's no excuse for killing and raping 5 people, Dr. Cuneo testified flatly. And yet when Fayne himself was asked why, he revealed only confusion. He once turned to a psychologist and pleaded, "Doc, can you or somebody look inside my head and tell me why I did this?" The answer was already written in the ledger of his childhood. Fayne was not born monstrous. He was manufactured, born to a mother whose drinking poisoned him in the womb, raised by a stepfather who beat him senseless, mocked by neighbors, abused by peers and adults, abandoned by everyone he ever trusted, repeatedly injured until his brain could no longer govern his impulses. If one were to construct a killer deliberately, as one expert said, you would raise him as Lorenzo Fayne was raised. This was not nurture nor neglect. It was corrosion, systematic, unrelenting, absolute. And by the time Lorenzo Fayne walked out of a juvenile facility at 17, the child who once cried at his grandmother's doorstep no longer existed. In his place was a disturbed vessel of rage, compulsion, and pathology, a boy meticulously sculpted into a predator. By the summer of 1989, Lorenzo Fayne had already walked a jagged path of delinquency and frustration. Raised amid instability and abuse, his life was a cauldron of suppressed rage, fractured impulses, and a festering sense of inadequacy. He was a young man drifting between Milwaukee and East St. Louis, carrying with him a hunger that defied reason. Fayne's descent into violence would not begin with an adult adversary, nor even a peer. His first known victim was a child, plucked from the safety of a neighborhood evening and delivered into horror. East St. Louis, July 14, 1989. The summer air of East St. Louis was heavy that evening, thick with humidity and the faint echoes of children's laughter weaving through the streets of the Parkside neighborhood. 2 6-year-old boys, cousins bound by innocence, played outside their homes as twilight fell. They were oblivious to the danger lurking nearby, a predator whose hunger had brought him into their orbit. A man approached, his voice carrying the lure of opportunity. He asked if they wanted to earn a little money. The offer, so simple and disarming, carried with it a trap the children could not perceive. One boy hesitated, wary. The other, Ari Hunt, small and trusting, accepted. He followed the stranger toward the expanse of Frank Holton State Park, unaware that he was walking directly into the abyss. Ari never returned. That night, when the cousin who had refused the offer spoke up, his revelation ignited panic. Families called the police and a frantic search commenced. Officers scoured the parkland, flashlights cutting through the darkness. At 2 a.m., beneath the viaduct that carried Interstate 255, they found him. The Ari's body lay beneath the concrete underpass shattered by brutality. Fayne directed the child underneath an underpass and twisted his neck until it snapped. The violence was merciless, the act both savage and deliberate. The boy went limp, but made some gurgling noises, so Fayne picked him up and slammed his head against a concrete wall, an unforgiving structure. His small frame reduced to a lifeless vessel. Then evil fully consumed Fayne. After the brutal killing, he desecrated Ari's small body by his corpse. When he was finished, he dragged the child into the weeds near the viaduct, abandoning him with the same disregard one might show for garbage. To Fayne, Ari was no longer a boy with a family, a laugh, a future. He was discarded, stripped of his humanity. The Illinois State Police Violent Crimes Unit descended upon the scene. Detectives believed they had a chance at justice. There were clues. The killer knew the neighborhood well enough to call Ari's brother by name. A bloody thumbprint was found pressed against the boy's thigh. A hauntingly personal signature, left in arrogance or haste. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, fingerprinting every man who lived nearby. Yet the murderer had already vanished. Lorenzo Fayne had slipped away to Milwaukee, blending back into his old haunts, leaving Parkside haunted by grief and unanswered questions. Years later, when pressed by psychologists, Fayne revealed the depth of his monstrous compulsion. That night, he claimed he had prowled the streets looking for somebody, anybody. The killing, he said, was driven not by plan but by impulse, an eruption of his dark appetite. In his confession to police, Fayne admitted a grotesque detail. He wanted to hear the sound of a neck snapping. Thus began his reign of terror. A crime so vicious it should have shattered the illusion of safety forever. Yet, it was only the first of many. October 4th, 1989, East St. Louis. Barely 3 months after the slaying of Ari Hunt, the fragile calm of East St. Louis shattered again. On the evening of October 4th, 1989, 16-year-old Nicole Willis, an honor roll student at Cahokia High School, stepped off a bi-state bus and began her familiar 10-minute walk home. The path was routine, unremarkable, one she had traced countless times before. Yet on this night, the most ordinary of journeys would deliver her into a nightmare. Nicole never arrived. Later, her body was discovered in a vacant lot, lying face up beneath the indifferent sky. Her head showing the unmistakable signs of blunt trauma, beaten savagely in an attack that left no chance for survival. The lot itself was a block from the site of Ari Hunt's abduction, as if the killer were leaving a macabre calling card in the very heart of the neighborhood. The autopsy revealed the appalling depths of the assault. Nicole had been sexually assaulted, then subjected to further desecration, her dignity stripped away in a manner that bespoke not only cruelty, but an intent to degrade even in death. It was more than murder. It was an act of obliteration designed to scar both victim and community. Detectives immediately recognized the echoes of Ari's fate. The proximity, the brutality, the grotesque treatment of the body, all bore the hallmarks of a predator who was not finished. Many investigators believed Lorenzo Fayne was responsible. His pathology fit, his proximity made sense. But for all their suspicions, they lacked the evidence to anchor him to that night. By early 1990, Fayne had returned to Milwaukee. There, he stole a car, was arrested, and spent 19 months in prison. To some, it explained the sudden lull in killings. Yet when confronted later, Fayne vehemently denied any involvement in Nicole Willis's death. He admitted to 5 murders, but in this case he drew the line, as though her death occupied a separate, shadowed space in his conscience. He was later ruled out by DNA evidence, and Nicole's murder remains a cold case to this day. For Nicole's family, the denial was meaningless. Their daughter, bright and ambitious, was gone, her life extinguished within a stone's throw of her own home. To the community, her murder was proof that the predator haunting East St. Louis was both remorseless and unrelenting. And when Fayne emerged from prison in 1992, the killings resumed, as though his imprisonment had been nothing more than an intermission in his descent into monstrosity. On March 20, 1992, the fragile normalcy of a spring evening in East St. Louis dissolved into one of the most brutal crimes the city would ever endure. LaTondra Dean, only 14 years old, was a runaway searching for stability. That night she played cards with friends, laughter and conversation disguising the danger that sat quietly among them. Lorenzo Fayne was there too, his presence unremarkable, his demeanor giving no hint of the horror he was about to unleash. Later, when LaTondra returned to the home where she was staying, Fayne followed. It was an intrusion cloaked in familiarity, the kind of act that raised no alarm until it was far too late. Inside, he sat with her on the couch as music played in the background, a scene that should have been ordinary, but in Fayne's mind something malignant was stirring. When he walked to the kitchen for a drink of water, his eyes caught on a knife. He picked it up, not by accident, but with deliberate intent. What followed was an eruption of violence that turned an everyday moment into a nightmare. Fayne forced LaTondra into a bedroom, where he violently raped her, then attacked with the knife in a frenzy that spoke of both control and cruelty. He stabbed her 21 times, the blade punctuating her final moments with unspeakable brutality. Even after her life was extinguished, Fayne's actions revealed a calculating coldness. He attempted to wash her body, an effort to conceal what he had done, before leaving her submerged in a bathtub. It was not remorse that guided his hands, but an attempt to erase the traces of his crime, to make the evidence of his savagery vanish into silence. For Mary Dean, LaTondra's mother, the discovery shattered her world. The grief was unbearable, the loss impossible to articulate. Her anguish hardened into fury, expressed in words that still echo with raw pain. If Fayne gets the death penalty, I would like to be the one who pulls the cord ending his life. It was the voice of a parent left to bury her child, condemned to carry the weight of a future stolen by violence. When Fayne later recounted the events to a psychiatrist, he spoke of them not with shame, but with an unnerving detachment, as though describing a casual decision instead of a life destroyed. His testimony exposed the chilling truth, that the murder of LaTondra Dean was not an explosion of passion, but the calculated choice of a predator who recognized opportunity and seized it with lethal resolve. 4 months after the slaying of LaTondra Dean, the city of East St. Louis was plunged once again into collective mourning. On July 20, 1992, the fragile innocence of a child's summer day was stolen in a manner so brazen, so grotesque, that it reverberated through the very soul of the community. Fallon Flood, 9 years old, had spent her afternoon at a summer lunch program held at East St. Louis High School. When she failed to return home, her mother's instinct told her something was wrong. She went searching the halls where her daughter was last seen, driven by the gnawing dread every parent fears but prays never to face. A gym teacher conducting a search made the grim discovery. Fallon was found inside a locker room, strangled with a belt. Her body hung in silence, a grotesque tableau that transformed an institution of learning into a mausoleum. The details made the horror sharper, a belt twisted into a tool of death, her underwear pulled down to her ankles, her small figure left desecrated in the very place where children should have felt safest. Autopsies later revealed the child was raped. Fallon had last been seen alive with another girl when Fayne approached them. He told Fallon to follow him, instructing the other child to leave. That single command, so easily given, so easily obeyed, marked the last living moments of Fallon's life. The crime was not just a murder, it was a violation of sacred space. To kill a child inside a school was to puncture the illusion of safety, to announce that even the most protected sanctuaries were vulnerable. The city erupted in outrage. Law enforcement, under crushing pressure, offered a $5,500 reward for information, desperate to restore public faith. Yet desperation bred catastrophe. Lorenzo Fayne, who worked as a janitor at the school, was briefly questioned but released without suspicion. Instead, investigators turned their focus to Charles King, another janitor, just 17 years old, with an intellectual disability that rendered him defenseless against manipulation. His IQ was measured at 57, leaving him with the comprehension of a child. Interrogated for days, King ultimately signed a confession he could not possibly understand. In his cell, he asked guards when his coloring books would arrive, unaware that the weight of a murder charge pressed down on him. For an entire year, an innocent boy languished in jail, branded as the killer of Fallon Flood, while the true predator had already slipped away. Fayne returned to Milwaukee, free to breathe, free to walk, free to stalk new victims. Only later, when Fayne confessed, would the truth finally surface. Fallon's death had been his all along. Thus, Fallon's tragedy carried a double wound: the murder of a child and the destruction of another innocent life through wrongful prosecution. Her name became synonymous not only with innocence lost, but also with systemic failure, a lesson in how predators can flourish when fear and haste override justice. By the summer of 1993, East St. Louis was a city fraying at the seams. The streets of the Parkside neighborhood pulsed with drugs, transient figures, and the constant hum of crime. Yet many still believed that the earlier murders of children were random, isolated acts. That belief would prove fatally naive. On June 25, 1993, Fayne returned from Milwaukee and once again prowled the city. He spotted Glenda Jones, a 17-year-old girl, as she cut across an open field behind Martin Luther King Jr. High School. To her, it was a shortcut home, a familiar route across a stretch of land she had no reason to fear. To him, it was opportunity. Glenda's mother, Ernestine Slaughter, later reflected on her own tragic miscalculation. "At the time, I really didn't think about it. I didn't think somebody was targeting kids," she admitted, words weighted with unbearable hindsight. She, like many others, believed the murders had been chance encounters, never suspecting that a single predator was weaving them into a pattern. Fayne closed in as Glenda crossed the field. What unfolded was swift and merciless. He stabbed her repeatedly, each thrust extinguishing the light of a young life not yet lived to its fullness. Death did not satisfy him. After killing her, he ripped her body, leaving behind not just a body but a crime scene that revealed the depths of his cruelty. For her mother, the loss was cataclysmic. What had once been dismissed as random violence became horrifyingly personal. The predator was not some abstract figure haunting other families. He had hunted her daughter, cut her down, and scarred her memory forever. Glenda's murder marked a turning point. The facade of randomness shattered. The killings were not isolated tragedies but deliberate acts in a calculated progression. Fayne had revealed himself as a serial predator, escalating in boldness and brutality with each victim. He moved through East St. Louis like a phantom, invisible until the devastation he left behind forced recognition. Together, the murders of Fallon Flood and Glenda Jones revealed a pattern too dark to ignore. Fayne was not a man who killed by accident or in passing fury. He selected, pursued, and destroyed. He exploited trust, vulnerability, and the fractured systems around him. In the span of 1 year, he claimed victims of 2 generations, a 9-year-old child and a 17-year-old on the cusp of adulthood. In doing so, Fayne left behind not only the ruined lives of his victims, but also a community steeped in paranoia and sorrow. Parents no longer saw schools as sanctuaries. Mothers no longer trusted that shortcuts home were safe. East St. Louis, already battered by poverty and crime, now lived under the shadow of a predator who proved that safety was an illusion. By the summer of 1993, East St. Louis was already a city suffocating under fear. The murder of Glenda Jones had left the community shaken, but the violence had not yet reached its peak. Barely a month later, on a day drenched in heat and tension, Firefighters were summoned to a blaze at the home of Annette Davis. They extinguished the flames only to uncover something far more harrowing than fire damage. Inside lay the body of Annette's 17-year-old daughter, Faith Davis. She had been stabbed to death. The fire, investigators soon discovered, was no accident. It had been set deliberately, a cruel attempt to reduce evidence to ash. Yet the perpetrator's effort to erase his crime only left behind more clues. Detectives combed the scene meticulously. Behind the Davis home, they noticed a dark, glistening trail that stretched into the night. Blood droplets marked a path like breadcrumbs leading to another house, the residence of Lee Fayne, aunt of the man whose name was already whispered among investigators, Lorenzo Fayne. Lee told officers her nephew had injured his hand and gone to St. Mary's Hospital in East St. Louis for treatment. Yet when police checked the hospital records, no one named Fayne had been admitted. Instead, paramedics revealed they had transported a young man who identified himself as Adam Smith, claiming he had cut his hand on a broken mirror. The deception unraveled quickly. Adam Smith was the name of a neighborhood youth who, as it turned out, was locked in juvenile detention at the time. Fayne had cloaked himself in the stolen identity, but the mask slipped. By that very day, police arrested him at his grandmother's home. When confronted, Fayne constructed a cold narrative of Faith's final moments. He admitted he had been burglarizing the Davis residence, passing stolen items out of the window to two accomplices waiting outside. Faith, armed with a knife, had attempted to defend her home. In the struggle, Fayne's hand was cut as he wrestled the blade away from her. He then used it against her, stabbing her repeatedly in a violent storm that left her broken on the floor. He stepped outside afterward, bloodied and breathless, and told his companions what had occurred. Overcome by fear, they fled into the night. But Fayne did not run. Instead, he returned inside, alone with the silence and the corpse of his victim. What followed revealed the full scope of his depravity. Fayne desecrated Faith's body after her death, an act that stripped away not only her life but her dignity. Then, in an effort to obliterate evidence, he set the house ablaze, hoping the fire would consume his crime in smoke and flame. But the flames betrayed him. The fire summoned rescuers whose hoses and axes uncovered not only Faith's body, but the trail that led back to him. The blood on the ground, the false name at the hospital, the cut on his hand, each piece tied the crime irrevocably to Lorenzo Fayne. Faith Davis was only 17, her youth stolen in a storm of violence and fire. The brazenness of the crime, a home invasion turned into murder, desecration, and arson, confirmed the escalating nature of Fayne's brutality. He was no longer content to stalk the vulnerable in alleys and fields. Now he invaded the sanctity of a family's home, and when confronted, he answered with murder. Her death marked another turning point in the dark catalog of Fayne's crimes, demonstrating that his hunger for destruction was not random but ever-expanding, pushing further into acts of depravity. When detectives first placed Lorenzo Fayne in custody, they didn't yet understand the magnitude of the monster they had captured. At the time, he was just another suspect in the killing of Faith Davis, a 17-year-old found stabbed to death in her burning home. But soon, small fragments of evidence began to converge into a revelation so grim, it altered the very way East St. Louis would remember its own history. The Illinois State Police were brought in to help interrogate him. Fayne, aloof and calculating, showed little interest in most officers, but he warmed to Special Agent Joe Bates, a man who sensed from the start that Fayne's crimes ran deeper than what had yet been uncovered. 10 days after Fayne's arrest, forensic results confirmed it. A bloody thumbprint found on the leg of 6-year-old Ari Hunt matched Fayne. The proof was irrefutable. With that evidence laid before him, Fayne admitted the truth. There was more to tell. For the first time, police realized they were not chasing a series of isolated tragedies. They had a serial killer. Bates cut short his vacation, returned, and spent 2 exhaustive days listening as Fayne began to unravel his secrets. What spilled out were 5 confessions, each one another nail in the coffin of innocence for families already broken. As Detective Crenshaw later remarked, realistically he could still be killing if he hadn't cut his hand. The wound from Faith Davis's knife, the slip of blood that betrayed him, had been the crack in the mask. Without it, Fayne might have continued prowling the streets, his appetite unchecked. For the families, Fayne's confessions were not revelations. They were confirmations of nightmares they had already endured. Their grief did not subside with answers. It sharpened into fury. Gloria Flood, mother of 9-year-old Fallon, cannot expel the vision from her mind. Her daughter being led down the corridor of East St. Louis High, taken toward the locker room where she would be strangled and left hanging. Sitting in her living room, a portrait of Fallon nearby. The girl in a bright floral dress, smiling shyly with her arm around her brother. Gloria's words spill out haltingly. For someone to hang you in a locker like you were nothing. Her grief is not softened by financial restitution. Though the school district later reached a settlement, Gloria insists money can never return what Fayne took. My daughter was just a baby. He just took everything away from her. She is not alone. Mary Dean, whose 14-year-old daughter Latondra was raped and stabbed 21 times, speaks with volcanic rage. If Fayne gets the death penalty, I would like to be the one who pulls the cord ending his life. The same demand echoes from Dessie William, mother of Ari Hunt. Her 6-year-old son's body had been left broken in weeds, a thumbprint pressed into his leg like a signature of ownership. Dessie moved away from Parkside afterward, unable to endure the proximity of a neighborhood where her child's killer had lived only blocks away. When I would go places and see people, I would wonder if they had done it. Her trust in humanity had dissolved into suspicion. She packed away nearly every photograph of her boy, unable to face them, leaving only one above her bed. Twice each year she travels to Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery, where his small headstone sits among rows of others claimed by war. Though Ari's battle had been nothing but survival in a city that could not protect him. At Fayne's trial, Dessie sat through the reading of his confession. Even then, she wrestled with questions that gnawed at her faith. I feel like I haven't done anything bad in my life. I feel like I was a good mother. It's hard to question the Lord. Sometimes I feel like I've been cheated. The family's demand for the death penalty was not fueled by abstract vengeance. It was born from the images that would never leave them. Fallon's body strung up in a locker as though she were refuse. Latondra's bloodied frame left in a bathtub. Ari's corpse discarded in weeds. Glenda's body desecrated in a field. Faith's house set ablaze to hide the mutilation within. Fayne's confession stripped away any lingering illusions. He was not a man who killed in a moment of rage. He was a predator who stalked, calculated, and destroyed. He desecrated the living and the dead alike, and each time he walked away, he left behind families condemned to a lifetime of grief. For East St. Louis, the capture of Lorenzo Fayne revealed a chilling truth. Evil had walked openly among them, shaking hands, playing cards, pushing brooms as a janitor, all while harboring the cold intent to slaughter. And but for a slip of a knife that cut his hand and spilled his blood, he might have remained invisible, killing still. In the early 1990s, the name Lorenzo Fayne began to circulate in whispers through the neighborhoods of East St. Louis, not merely as a suspect, but as a specter. He had already confessed to killing 5 children: Ari Hunt, Fallon Flood, Glenda Jones, Latondra Dean, and Faith Davis. Yet the path from confession to sentencing would prove as tortured as the crimes themselves. The courtrooms of St. Clair County became theaters of anguish, where families of the slain were forced to sit through the unbearable retelling of how their children were stolen. Prosecutors moved swiftly to indict Fayne for multiple murders, beginning with the most haunting of them all, the 1989 killing of 6-year-old Ari Hunt. It was the first case to go before a jury, a deliberate strategy by state's attorney Robert Haida to secure a death sentence that could then serve as precedent for the others. The defense fought bitterly, filing motion after motion to suppress Fayne's confessions, claiming he had been denied a lawyer during interrogations and isolated for 24 days. They painted him as a product of a poisoned childhood, beaten by his alcoholic mother, possibly brain damaged from repeated head trauma and fetal alcohol exposure. Court psychologist Daniel Cuneo testified that Fayne's mind had been compromised from the beginning. He's had a repeated history of head trauma. He was choked until unconscious. He may have been born with fetal alcohol syndrome. Yet prosecutors dismiss this as a smokescreen, a desperate attempt to shield a man they described as a sadist who preyed on children and violated their bodies even after death. The first trial opened in July 1994, and it was Ari Hunt's mother, Desi Wiggum, who bore the brunt of its cruelty. She sat in the courtroom, forced to endure testimony that her son had been sodomized, his head crushed against a concrete wall, his small body discarded in weeds at Frank Holton State Park. She flinched as Fayne's own confession was read aloud. He had killed Ari because he wanted to hear the sound of a child's neck snapping. Wiggum later told reporters, "Everybody who knew Ari just fell in love." But the words could not blunt the imagery of what Fayne had done. After days of testimony, the jury returned with its verdict. Fayne was found guilty of first-degree murder in the killing of Ari Hunt. But when the time came to decide his punishment, the panel fractured. 11 jurors voted for death, 1 refused. The deadlock meant Fayne escaped execution. The families looked on in disbelief as the opportunity for capital punishment evaporated with a single dissenting voice. Judge James K. Donovan delivered the sentence on August 30th, 1994. Staring at Fayne, he declared, "This case was the most chilling I have ever dealt with. The violence perpetrated on that little boy, perhaps after he was dead, shows what this man is capable of is beyond the imagination of anybody in this courtroom." Then he passed down life without parole. "It means, Mr. Fayne, that you will die in the penitentiary." In court, Fayne offered a hollow apology. "Sorry is all I can say. I can't bring him back." But the words rang empty to the families who sat stone-faced, clutching photographs of the children whose lives he had obliterated. By 2001, after years of litigation and appeals, Fayne stood once more before a judge and entered a plea. He pleaded guilty to 4 murders: Latondra Dean, Fallon Flood, Glenda Jones, and Faith Davis, sparing families additional trials, but ensuring that he would never again see freedom. In exchange for the plea, prosecutors abandoned multiple death penalty hearings and consolidated sentencing. Fayne was sentenced to additional life terms, stacked upon his first, each one a permanent wall sealing him inside the penitentiary. When the final gavel fell, Fayne had avoided execution, but only barely. He was destined to live out his years caged, surrounded not by children but by the concrete walls of a prison that would be his tomb. For the families, it was not enough. They had prayed for death, begged for it, demanded it. Instead, they received a promise from the judge that Fayne would die in captivity, his name forever shackled to the horrors he had inflicted. But the damage was already done. Desi Wiggum had lost all 3 of her children to violence. Gloria Flood could still see her daughter's shy smile frozen in a school photograph. Mary Dean still burned with the wish to end Fayne's life with her own hands. And through it all, Fayne, once a boy beaten in Milwaukee, later a man who became the most notorious child killer in Metro East history, sat in chains, his fate sealed not by execution but by the slow passage of years behind bars. In the end, justice came not with the swiftness of the needle, but with the endless drag of time. Lorenzo Fayne will draw his final breath behind penitentiary walls, but the lives he extinguished echo louder than any sentence imposed upon him. The laughter of children silenced, the photographs clutched by grieving mothers, the memories carved into the marrow of East St. Louis. These are the true life sentences, endured not by Fayne, but by the families left in his wake.